Perfect. Well, what do you say? Let's go ahead and get started, Chris. I'll maybe handle some of the housekeeping items for today's roundtable discussion. I'll introduce myself and our topic of conversation for today, and over the next 15-20 minutes together, I'll allow Chris to introduce himself and his role at the Churchill Archives Centre, and then we'll dig into the conversation together. So really quick, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to have Chris joining us and really excited for the conversation. Um, as I mentioned, a few housekeeping items. So as everyone has seen, we certainly do have the chat available. We'd love to hear from you as we chat through our discussion today. The other thing that I will share is there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So I know some folks have actually submitted some questions ahead of time, but as we progress through our conversation today, if you have any questions, please feel free to use that. We'll do our best to get to all questions that we can prior to wrapping up today. And if we can't get to it, we'll make sure to follow up post our conversation. Everyone is muted to allow for an easy listening experience. But as I mentioned, we definitely love to hear from you. So definitely feel free to use the Q&A if you have any questions as we progress. Um, Before I allow Chris to introduce himself, for the folks that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Chandler Cox. So I'm with the Libnova team. As I mentioned in the chat to lead us off, I'm based in Charleston, South Carolina, here in the United States. We've got team members from Libnova spread out all across the globe, but I'm based here with our US team. I'm honored to be joined by Chris Knowles from the Churchill Archives Centre. Chris, did you want to say maybe a quick hello to the audience before we get started?
Yeah, hi. I'm Chris. I'm the digital archivist here at Churchill. I've been here since late 2019. And just to give a feel of who we are, we're a team of about 15 staff, and we hold broadly 20th century and onwards British material. But we hold things of international significance. So we've got the papers of Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, things like that. We hold personal papers, while their official papers are with the National Archives. But we've got a great deal of holdings with interest from all over the world.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. Well, and just to frame a little bit of our conversation today, for everyone that's joining us, certainly I know in the world around us today, there's certainly a lot of organizations and maybe or institutions, and maybe you're one of them, if you're listening to this today, that are really looking to either improve their digital preservation, practices and strategies, or maybe even launch a digital preservation program. And so, really, today, wanted to unpack a bit with Chris. Given his experience, what was successful in establishing a digital preservation program? Where do you start? Right? How do you start to circulate some of these concepts internally? What resonates with leadership? Um, were there things that you wish you would have thought of, right? Maybe beforehand, or maybe were there unintended benefits in other areas that we didn't consider, maybe whenever we were embarking on this type of overall strategy. So we hope to unpack that a little bit today as a group. So Chris, maybe where I'll start is, when digital preservation, and I know this is a big part of your role coming into the organization and institution, but when digital preservation first became a priority at the Churchill Archives Centre, what was the trigger?
So I think well, before I joined, people have been they've known that something needed to be done. We had lots of digital material just in carriers sitting on shelves, which had never been copied onto new systems. And the digital holdings that we did have were just on local storage, which was working fine, but was susceptible to accidental editing, deletion, that sort of thing. And the team here were very good at realizing that something better was needed. And honestly, I think what they were looking for perhaps was a system to just do digital federation for them and which is handle things. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of the after I joined it, a lot of it was really scoping out what was needed, what digital federation meant, kind of much more broadly, and what systems we could get into that for us, and what things we needed to develop in house.
Yeah, makes total sense. Well, and I would imagine, and even from speaking with other folks in some of our past roundtables, um, I know explaining digital preservation or connecting the dots, right, for folks that maybe aren't quite as close to this work as we all are. Sometimes, one can be a challenge at times. But also, I know from other folks, they've mentioned that they've used analogies, right, or those storytelling to try to connect the dots for folks. I'm curious, from your standpoint, how do you maybe you explain digital preservation internally to people who may not be as close to your work every day, or maybe even not internally, maybe externally? I don't know. Any ideas of things that's worked or ways that you've helped to simplify maybe this work for others?
So I think actually the best resource for that here was resources from the Digital Federation Coalition. So underlying this was a respected authority essentially, and when they say these things should be considered, that should be taken seriously. I know Mark, the director here did their I guess novice to know how course, for example, to try and get some basics in. But yeah, I didn't find that legitimate authority which they recognised, and saying, well, look, well, they say we should be considering this, and so we should. It worked well.
Awesome. I love that. Well, and I know you mentioned too, that you all were storing, right? So you had storage, right, of those digital assets, which I think probably is where a lot of folks start, I would say. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Chris, but I find that a lot of folks maybe start with storage and then start to realize, that maybe storage isn't quite enough. But I'm curious from your standpoint, when someone says or someone thinks, you know, hey, we already have storage, aren't we covered? How do you maybe respond or connect the dots for folks?
Well, actually, a lot of our digital material was stored physically. We have floppy different things
Ah,
physically here, but we didn't have the technology or the ability to actually make copies of them. So we've got lots of 8-inch discs, 5.25-inch discs, zip discs, weird tape things, all that kind of stuff. And that was just sitting on shelves here, which again we held, but actually access was very, very far away. Um, for the digital storage, um, uh, the we've got terabytes and terabytes of digitized physical collections. That's the majority of our holdings, really. Bond digital is relatively small, and we it was I could point to errors that have been made. So I could say, look, clearly this file has been moved and stored in the wrong place. This thing here is missing. Like, we can't find it. We're going to need to be image it. And of course, then saying, well, for foreign digital stuff, you can't do that. So we needed something better, and we could have implemented some better sort of access controls just for these with simple Windows system we were using. But that I was able to think people that really won't be a short term thing. And really, we wanted that the multiple location storage, the redundancy, that sort of thing. Because we were going to get some unique things that be an archive, and it was far too easy to accidentally edit a thing and change it irrevocably.
yeah, totally. Well, And honestly, that aligns a little bit with the next thing I was going to ask. Um, I know oftentimes, it could be a challenge just to locate digital objects, which is kind of what you mentioned. But I'm curious, and I don't know if you have thoughts here, but I've always found, there's some examples maybe that I've heard from, folks in the space, but or practitioners like yourself of good examples. But how do you communicate preservate digital preservation risk when maybe loss hasn't happened yet? Um,
Mm.
I mean, any ideas there? Is examples maybe the best way to make that happen? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
So in terms of the kind of risk, the risk of loss is harder to communicate, but the risk of obsolescence is much easier. Um, it is very easy to point out that we have all these things we can't get the files off, and then once the files are off, all these things we can't access, and we need to develop something better. Um, and I think when we started this, we had imagined, maybe hoped, that there'd be one system which could just open all the files we wanted, that sort of thing. In the end, it hadn't worked out that way. And we do most of the file conversion and manipulation locally, and belong our Lenovo products for the preservation. But coming to that understanding was definitely a journey.
Muted myself. I think that's a great example. Well, because I mean, at least for me, being someone relatively new to the digital preservation space, that those types of examples help to connect the dots for me because it's things that I've experienced, even if it's on a smaller scale in my regular life, right? I mean, we've all had experiences maybe where, older tech, time goes on, right? Things on that old on older technology become obsolete, right? Or you try to access a file in a very old file format, right? And like your example. So some of these simple examples, I agree. I think the communicating obsolescence oftentimes can help to connect the dots, I think, because folks have experienced that a little bit, right, in their life. Okay, awesome. Um, Let's see. Whenever you all were really looking to improve digital preservation, um, I would imagine coordinating internally with other teams was probably important, right? I don't know. IT, I'm sure was involved. I don't know if leadership was. Talk to me about that, Chris. Did you all have kind of the autonomy to kind of do things yourself? Were you having to bring other folks along? How was that
Well,
experience?
due to being this relatively small 15-person team, albeit within a
Yeah.
bigger college, it it was I had quite a lot of autonomy. I was doing the research. I was following the UK National Archives published a very a good guide with examples from various institutions, for example, and I was working through that, trying to work out what we needed, what others didn't. We did have some support from from the IT team here on site, but that was they they happily implement settings in our environment for us, but they weren't going to go to research how to open weird file formats if you needed like an emulator. They help us use Word or that sort of thing, but it's quite a different thing. Yes, I feel lucky to have a lot of autonomy, honestly.
That's awesome. I know, yeah, I know it can probably vary, I would imagine, based on the
Mm.
institution or organization, regarding how that would work internally. But that's good to know. I mean, I guess going back again to, working to improve some of these processes, maybe for the folks that are on the line that are looking for maybe a practical first step. Um, for an institution that maybe has maybe they have digital assets. Maybe they've digitized some materials over the years. Maybe they're starting to get some born digital, like a lot of us. Um, what would you maybe recommend as a first practical step for folks that maybe have digital assets, but they don't have maybe a mature preservation program?
Mm. So, well, trying to work out honestly what you're capable of in a house, and how much time you're willing to spend on that. It is really useful. There are various tasks which we could do in house, but currently don't. Because they don't have a system going forth, but also would be quite laborious. So things like uh, file format identification and metadata extraction, for example, are things we would be capable of doing, but would much rather automate as opposed to uh, file migration, for example, where we actually really want that kind of fine detail control over quite how we generate our active copies, for example.
Yeah. For maybe for the same group that's maybe looking for a practical first step, or maybe even just looking to build the internal case
Mhm.
for investment in this area around digital preservation. Um, what's maybe one piece of advice that you give for folks? I mean, I know that's an open-ended question, but any thoughts there of for folks that are looking to maybe circulate this idea internally, build
Mm.
a case, etc.?
So I would say that ultimately, if you can't access something, then there's no point in holding it. And so, really, there's an argument for if you aren't going to invest in digital preservation, then you should be looking at deaccessioning, and that really clarifies the mind well. I mean, and some places that will be the solution. Hopefully, not many, but and for many things, especially obviously formats, which I do a lot of work on, as time passes, things get harder to get into. So, uh, for example, you can buy just about an 18 copy guide on eBay today, but in 20 years, no chance. You can buy a USB CD drive off Amazon nowadays. But actually, even those are going to get harder and harder to get. Um, and so, yeah, especially in that sense, time really is of the essence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to your point, it's almost technology, again, I need to say this to this group on the line today because we're all living in it, but technology is advancing very quickly around us and things are changing drastically. Um, especially around just digital objects and just the digital world in general. And so it's almost becoming a bigger need to get a little more strategic to ensure that as technology changes, that we can keep up and ensure our legacy and culture is still accessible, exactly like what you mentioned. Um, I want to shift a little bit. So maybe a couple more questions, and then we have a few questions from folks that have submitted as we've been chatting. But whenever you were kind of going through this journey to land where you are today, I would imagine you had a pretty good idea of some of the things that you wanted to accomplish or be able to do. But were there any unexpected benefits that you saw from embarking on this type of journey or initiative? Like I think you mentioned, metadata and some work around that,
Yeah.
for example. But any ideas there of maybe just some other areas that were maybe were improved or streamlined just by embarking on this?
Yeah. So when we were looking for a management system, we had a few requirements. We needed somewhere which had data centers in the UK, just because of the nature of our collections and the risk, albeit small, of official secret stuff accidentally ending up in our collections, which not everyone will have. Some people will be happy with data everywhere, but we had that at a hard result. And we also wanted something which could something which could communicate with our own catalog, which is our archive space, and something which had a front end where we could show material to researchers as well as a storage backend. And yes, with Go, we never scoped that we wanted or needed metadata extraction or file. We needed fixity type things, absolutely. That we had that under preservation, but actually the file analysis, the full metadata extraction running in Apache Sheep and things, and being able to search full text over anything where you could extract text had been a massive benefit, which we didn't know we needed. Well, we didn't know we wanted, but had been really useful. Whereas on the counterpoint, that idea originally of a system which would open any file format to us, we have abandoned, and we now know that that's something we probably really need to do locally instead.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Well, and some good comments in the chat too, as we've been chatting. Um, Joshua mentioned, and I love this. It's a duty to our collection, right? It's our duty as the safeguards of the collections of materials that we hold so dear, right, at our organizations. It's the history and legacy. Um,
Yes, we have a collecting policy for what we would like to have, but of course, if we can't then store that and make it accessible, for physical or for digital material, it really is analogous in that way. And that's a good point. And underlining how analogous the digital and the physical case is, where the physical case, if you can't make it available, if it's such an awful state that it can't be made available, that it can't be saved by conservators, actually, is there any value to it? You can apply a similar thing to digital.
yeah, totally. Well, and Benjamin too. I love your comment, Benjamin. And it makes me think of it's a conversation. I've told this on a session previously, so I won't belabor the point. But I was visiting in a cultural institution and organization, and one of their leaders framed it, framed our work and digital preservation in a way that really clicked for me. And also Danielle from the University of Indiana, who we had on a previous session a couple months back, used a similar analogy. We do so much to safeguard and protect the physical, right? We've got climate controlled rooms. We've got security, all around the building. We've got all the things to protect the physical. Digital preservation in my mind is adopting a lot, although a different lens, of course, but adopting a lot of those core principles for our digital assets and collections and treating them, with the same amount of care. So I always like that analogy. And exactly, Benjamin, you're right. Making sure, I mean, digital preservation is all about, making sure in 10, 20, 50 years that whenever we go to access these materials, that we can access them, that we can still use them. Um, I love that. Absolutely. Okay. Chris, maybe a fun last question, if you don't mind. Um, and I know, this is probably a really tough question. And I won't use the word favorite, but maybe what's an interesting digital object or something within your collection, over the years, maybe that's maybe fun or interesting that you can maybe highlight or share.
So I don't want to be up here. So as I say, we collect people's personal papers, and they often come from homes, things kind of attic, that sort of thing. But for one collection, we were given a memory stick from an old computer, and clearly what they'd done is just copied the entire machine onto a large memory stick. Great. And it had the subjects, the subject of the collection. It had lots of stuff that we're really interested in, all their documents and things. Great. But it was clearly the family computer. So we had material from their children as well. So it turned out we've been wholly looking after their son's championship manager 2004 saved games, for example, which is just lovely. And once we identified that, we have in the end got rid of the things which weren't we never intended to collect in that sense. But we made a record that we were given them. And yeah, it's just a really interesting thing to discover.
That's awesome. I love that. Okay, perfect. We've got a couple questions and maybe we'll take a couple because I know we don't have a ton of time left. And maybe this first one, Chris, and maybe you and I maybe can give our thoughts. Um, we got a question. What's the difference between digital asset management and digital preser or software and digital preservation software? Is it worth having both? And this individual is coming from a museum. Maybe I'll take a stab, Chris, and then you can maybe keep me honest or see if you agree or disagree. And you're not going to hurt my feelings. But I'd say the biggest thing is that we're solving different challenges. And we're addressing different needs whenever we think about digital asset management and digital preservation. And I'm going to unpack it a little bit, try to, the way that I think about it. So digital asset management, in my mind, is about working with files today, right? It's organizing and sharing and distributing your digital content. And I think of it almost as like a smart library, right? Where you're looking for something, right? You're looking for a logo or looking for materials, right? You can download the right version, you can share a video with a client. In my mind, it's optimized for workflow and access. Now, digital preservation is about protecting the digital for the future and ensuring those materials are going to be accessible long term. It's ensuring that, like Chris has talked about a little bit today, it's ensuring that content remains readable. It's uncorrupted, right, over time, and authentic, decades from now, especially in the world of AI. Um, when it comes to digital preservation, and we didn't unpack this a lot today, Chris, so maybe this is a future session, but digital preservation, right? We're actively monitoring file integrity. We're doing things like fixity checks to our collections over time. We're updating our files to new file formats before old ones become obsolete, like we've talked about today. Um, but I think digital preservation, in my mind, is optimized for longevity and authenticity and accessibility of digital collections. I don't know, Chris, thoughts?
I think that broadly it is one of the things which is a question of terminology, and I'm sure there are products which claim they're both or one of them and a lot of overlap. But yeah, I think I really would underline that preservation is not just the integrity and the fixity; it is also the accessibility. Deriving access copies is a preservation action, not just a management action. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Awesome. Okay, we're at time. Um, Actually, you know what? We've got one more that I'm going to squeeze in, Chris. Um, and then we'll wrap. So this is more from a small institution lens. Okay. Um, how strictly should smaller institutions follow the OASE digital preservation model? So we're talking about standards, Chris. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts there?
So I will admit that I am not the biggest fan of IAS and that we do not adhere to it here. I certainly don't apply its terminology everywhere. I know some institutions are very strict on that, but I've not found a great benefit from that. Understanding from the idea that the distribution version, the access copy is different to your archival copy, or maybe for simple objects, actually, for us, they're the same. So yes, I for that one in particular, I would not worry about using that as something prescriptive. Absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. I think from the vendor side, my only thoughts are, whether you adhere to certain standards or not. I think any potential partner, and again, this is just me putting myself almost in everyone's shoes, but for any potential, technology partner, I'd want the option to adopt, certain standards, even if it's not today, right, Chris? Exactly like you said, but maybe there's a new standard down the line, right, that we want to make sure our systems are aligned with, that we actually do want to adopt. So I think it's ensuring that your partners are aligned to standards, whether you take advantage of those or not, right? Totally up to your institution and organization. But anyway,
Yeah, but of course, it's also important to understand that there's standards like a core trust seal that
yes.
people achieve, versus the OAIF, which is more a method of working. They're quite different
Yeah.
in that sense.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for hanging on. Not too far over 3 minutes. But Chris, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for sharing your expertise and thoughts with everyone. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned, we're going to send the recording and follow up in case it's of interest or you share with colleagues. Keep an eye out. We do these sessions once a month. We try to get folks, industry practitioners like Chris, to come share their expertise, lessons learned. So a great format to do that. Chris, thank you again. Thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll be in touch. Thanks everyone. Take care.